Richard Caldwell mocked his wife Claire at the Solstice Gala, calling her a charity case to impress the elite. He didn't know Claire was actually the secret heir to the Kensington fortune and the new owner of his firm, Sterling and Finch. When the executor Alexander revealed her identity, Richard's arrogance crumbled. Worse, a private investigator exposed Richard's embezzlement scheme, where he forged Claire's signature to frame her. Claire promptly fired him and handed him over to the FBI. 6 months later, Richard sits in prison while Claire leads the company, transforming it with integrity and proving that power whispers. For 7 years, Claire Caldwell had perfected the art of becoming invisible. It wasn't a magic trick. It was a survival mechanism. In the sprawling, cold architecture of their minimalist penthouse in downtown Chicago, she moved like a ghost. She knew exactly which floorboards creaked and how to set a coffee cup down on a marble coaster without making a sound. Silence was the only thing that didn't irritate Richard. Richard Caldwell was a man who seemed to have been manufactured rather than born. He was a senior VP at Sterling and Finch, a boutique equity firm that managed money for people who owned islands, not just houses. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, jawline like a cliff edge, eyes the color of polished steel, and a smile that appeared only when he closed a deal or belittled a waiter. To the outside world, he was a golden boy. To Claire, he was a ceiling that was slowly lowering inch by inch, day by day, threatening to crush her. "Claire." His voice boomed from the walk-in closet, shattering the morning calm. Claire froze in the kitchen, a dish rag in her hand. She took a breath, steeling herself, and walked toward the bedroom. "Yes, Richard." He was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting a silk tie that probably cost more than Claire's first car. He didn't look at her. He looked at her reflection, his lip curling slightly. "This shirt," he said, gesturing to the crisp white Egyptian cotton on his chest. "It's not starched properly. The collar is limp. Do I look like a mid-level manager to you? Do I look like someone who flies commercial?" "I picked it up from the dry cleaners myself, Richard. They said meton." "I don't care what they said," he snapped, finally turning to face her. The look in his eyes wasn't hatred. It was worse. It was boredom. "You have one job, Claire. You don't work. You don't bring in money. You don't have a social circle to manage. You manage me. And you're failing." It was a lie, of course. Claire did work, though Richard refused to acknowledge it. She was a freelance archival researcher, restoring old manuscripts and verifying lineages for historical societies. It paid modestly, but she loved the smell of old paper and the secrets hidden in ink. Richard called it her little hobby and forbade her from talking about it at dinner parties. "Nobody cares about dusty books, Claire. They care about the NASDAQ." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. It was her mantra. "I'll have it redone." "Don't bother. I'm late." He grabbed his jacket. "Tonight." The invitation arrived for the Obsidian Gala. Claire felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The Obsidian Gala was the event of the decade. Hosted by the enigmatic Kensington Trust, it was an invite-only gathering of the global elite. Rumors had been swirling for months that the Trust was finally going to announce the successor to the Kensington fortune, a lineage thought to have died out. "Are you taking me?" she asked. Usually, Richard took his executive assistant, a sharp-tongued woman named Jessica, who looked like she was carved out of ice and ambition. Richard laughed a short, barking sound. "Jessica is in Tokyo closing the Nakamura deal. You're the backup. Just try not to embarrass me, all right? Wear something expensive, or at least something that looks like it didn't come from a bin." He brushed past her, checking his reflection one last time. "And Claire, don't speak unless spoken to. These people are sharks. You're barely a minnow." As the elevator doors slid shut, sealing him away, Claire let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. She walked over to the window, looking out at the grey skyline. Richard thought she was a minnow. He thought she was a nobody from a small town in Ohio, with no family and no history. He was right about the Ohio part, but he was wrong about the history. Claire walked to her small desk in the guest room, the only room Richard rarely entered, and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside wasn't jewelry or cash. It was a letter yellowed with age, postmarked from Zurich, and a heavy signet ring bearing a crest of phoenix rising from a fortress. She ran her thumb over the wax seal. Tonight was the Obsidian Gala. The Kensingtons were hosting. "I won't embarrass you, Richard," she whispered to the empty room. "But you might find the evening enlightening." The limousine ride was suffocating. Richard spent the entire 40 minutes on a call barking orders about shorting a pharmaceutical stock. Claire sat in the corner, smoothing the fabric of her dress. She had disobeyed him. He had thrown a credit card at her and told her to buy something flashy from a designer he liked. Instead, she had worn a vintage gown she found in a specialty boutique. It was a deep midnight blue velvet, high-necked and long-sleeved, with an open back that added a touch of severe elegance. It didn't scream money. It whispered class. Richard ended the call as the car pulled up to the curb. He looked her up and down, his nose wrinkling. "I gave you $5,000, he muttered, "and you look like a Victorian librarian." "It's vintage Holston, Richard," she said calmly. "It's depressing," he countered. "Whatever. Just stay close to the wall. I need to find Beatrice Delacroix. If I can get 5 minutes with her, I can secure the merger." The venue was the Grand Vandever Hotel, a Gilded Age palace that smelled of orchids and old money. The paparazzi were a wall of flashing lights at the entrance. Richard stepped out, buttoning his jacket, putting on his master of the universe smile. He grabbed Claire's arm, not affectionately, but with a grip tight enough to leave a bruise, and pulled her onto the red carpet. "Smile," he hissed through his teeth as the cameras flashed. "Look like you belong here." Inside the ballroom was a sea of black ties and diamonds. A string quartet played Debussy in the corner, but the music was drowned out by the hum of deals being made. Waiters moved like shadows, offering trays of caviar and gold-flaked truffles. Claire felt the familiar wave of anxiety. But tonight it was different. Tonight she felt a strange vibrating energy in the air. She scanned the room. She recognized faces from the news tech moguls, royalty heirs to oil fortunes, and then she saw him. Standing on a raised platform near the back was a man with silver hair and a posture that suggested he carried the weight of the world with ease. Alexander Kensington, the executor of the trust. He was looking at the crowd, his eyes scanning faces. For a split second, his gaze landed on Claire. He didn't smile, but he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked away quickly. "Richard!" a voice boomed. A heavy-set man with a red face and a cigar, despite the smoking ban, waddled over. It was devout billionaire Thomas O'Leary, one of Richard's biggest clients. "Thomas!" Richard released Claire's arm instantly, extending his hand. "Good to see you. You remember. My wife." He said "my wife," the way one might say "my old Volvo." Thomas glanced at Claire, barely registering her existence. Charmed. Richard, listen. I heard a rumor that the Kensington heir is actually in the building tonight. Can you believe it? $50 billion just sitting in an escrow account waiting for some long-lost brat to claim it. Richard laughed, sipping his scotch. It's a fairy tale, Thomas. There is no heir. The old man died without children. The trust is just putting on a show to drive up the value of their holdings before they liquidate. It's a classic pump and dump disguised as a pageant. You think so? I know so, Richard said arrogantly. If there was an heir, they'd be someone of consequence. You don't hide that kind of pedigree. You wear it. Claire took a sip of her sparkling water. You don't hide it, she thought, unless knowing who you are puts a target on your back. Go get me another drink, Claire, Richard said, handing her his empty glass without looking at her. Thomas and I need to talk strategy. Claire took the glass. She was being dismissed. As she walked toward the bar, she felt eyes on her. Not Richard's, not Thomas's, but the eyes of the staff. The head waiter, a man she recognized from previous events, caught her eye. He didn't look through her this time. He looked deferential. Mrs. Caldwell, the bartender said, before she even ordered. Mr. Kensington has requested that the 78 Macallan be reserved for the special guests, but he specifically asked if you would like a glass. Claire froze. I think my husband wants a scotch and soda. The bartender smiled a genuine, knowing smile. Of course. And for you, madam, just water. Thank you. She returned to Richard, who was now encircled by a group of young, hungry associates and the stunning Beatrice Delacroix. Beatrice was everything Claire wasn't, loud blonde, and wearing a dress that was more skin than fabric. Richard was in his element. He was holding court. Oh, look, she's back, Richard said, as Claire approached. The group turned to look at her. Beatrice smirked. Is this the little wife? Beatrice asked, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. Richard talks about you, occasionally. Here's your drink, Richard, Claire said, extending the glass. Richard didn't take it immediately. He let her hold it there, her arm outstretched for a few uncomfortable seconds. A power play. You know, Richard said to the group, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. I was just telling Beatrice about our honeymoon, or rather the lack of one. The group chuckled. Claire here is terrified of flying, Richard lied. And boats, and really anything that involves leaving the house. I tried to take her to the Maldives and she had a panic attack in the terminal. We ended up spending 2 weeks in her aunt's cabin in Wisconsin. It was a complete fabrication. Richard had cancelled their honeymoon to go on a golf trip with his boss. Oh, you poor thing, Beatrice cooed, touching Richard's arm. It must be so hard, Richard being married to someone so fragile. It's a charity project, really, Richard said, taking the drink finally. But I'm a patient man. Everyone needs a hobby. Some people collect cars. I collect broken things. The group erupted in laughter. Heat rose in Claire's cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a sudden white-hot fury. She looked at Richard, really looked at him. She saw the insecurity behind the arrogance. She saw a man so desperate to be big that he had to make everyone else small. She was about to speak, to finally say something, when the lights in the ballroom dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. A spotlight hit the stage. Alexander Kensington walked up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice echoed through the silence. Welcome to the Obsidian Gala. Tonight is not just a celebration of wealth. It is a celebration of truth. Richard leaned into Beatrice, whispering loud enough for Claire to hear. "Here comes the show. Watch him trot out some actor to play the long-lost prince." "Tonight," Alexander continued, "marks the end of the Kensington Trust's guardianship. For 30 years we have managed the estate of the late Silas Kensington, waiting for the stipulations of his will to be met. The search has been long. It has been global. And it has been secret." The room was dead silent. "Many of you believe the line ended. Many of you." Alexander's eyes seemed to drill into Richard. "Believe this is a performance. But I am pleased to announce that the heir has been found. The sole beneficiary of the Kensington estate, valued at approximately $62 billion, including the controlling interest in Sterling and Finch." Richard choked on his drink. "Sterling and Finch. That's my firm. The Kensingtons own the controlling interest." "They do now," Beatrice whispered, stepping away from him slightly. "The heir is in this room," Alexander announced. A murmur ran through the crowd. People began looking around, eyeing each other suspiciously. "Is it you?" Someone asked a duke. "Is it him?" Someone pointed at a tech CEO. "And," Alexander said, raising a hand, "the heir has requested that before they step forward, we acknowledge the people who have supported them on their journey." Richard straightened his tie. "It's got to be someone in this circle. Maybe it's Beatrice. Beatrice, is it you?" Beatrice shook her head, looking wide-eyed. "The heir," Alexander said, "is a woman of immense patience. A woman who has endured slants. A woman who has been underestimated by everyone in this room." Claire set her glass down on a passing waiter's tray. Her hands were shaking, but she clasped them together. Richard scoffed. "Sounds like a sob story. Probably some waitress they found." "Richard," Claire said. Her voice was low, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a razor. "Not now, Claire," Richard hissed, standing on his tiptoes to see the stage. "I'm trying to see who it is." "Richard," she said again, louder. He spun around, furious. What could you possibly have to say right now that is more important than—" "I think," Claire said, her eyes locking onto his. "He's talking about me." Richard stared at her for a second, blinked, and then burst out laughing. It was a loud, ugly sound that drew the attention of the people around them, including Thomas O'Leary and Beatrice. "You—" Richard wiped a tear from his eye. "Oh, that is rich. That is the funniest thing you have ever said, Claire. You, the Kensington heir." He turned to Beatrice. "Did you hear that?" "She thinks she's the heir." Beatrice giggled, covering her mouth. "Oh, honey, that's adorable. Delusional but adorable." "Claire," Richard said, his voice dropping to a patronizing tone he used for children. "Silas Kensington was a titan of industry. You are. You buy your clothes at thrift stores. You don't know the difference between a bond and a stock. You're a researcher, Claire. You look at dust. Please stop embarrassing me." "I don't buy my clothes at thrift stores because I have to." "Richard," Claire said, her voice steadying, "I do it because I don't need fabric to tell me who I am." "Enough," Richard snapped, his face reddening. "Sit down and shut up. You're making a scene." But the scene was already being made, because Alexander Kensington was no longer looking at the crowd. He was walking down the stairs of the stage. The spotlight was following him. He moved through the parted sea of billionaires like a shark through water. He walked past the Duke. He walked past the tech mogul. He was heading straight for the cluster of people where Richard was standing. Richard straightened up, puffing out his chest. "He's coming here," he whispered to Thomas. "He's coming to me." I told you I'm up for partner next month. Maybe he knows my work." Richard stepped forward, extending his hand as Alexander approached. "Mr. Kensington, an honor." "Richard Caldwell, Sterling and Finch. I've admired your—" Alexander Kensington walked right past Richard's outstretched hand. He didn't even slow down. He brushed past Richard's shoulder, knocking him slightly off balance. Richard stumbled, turning around in shock. "Excuse me." Alexander stopped. He was standing 3 feet in front of Claire. The entire ballroom went silent. The music had stopped. The clinking of glasses had ceased. Every eye in the room was fixed on the woman in the midnight blue velvet dress. Alexander Kensington bowed. It wasn't a nod. It was a deep, formal bow, the kind reserved for monarchs. "Madame," Alexander said, his voice carrying in the silence, "we have awaited your command." Claire looked at Alexander. Then she slowly turned her gaze to Richard. Richard's face had gone the color of ash. His mouth was opening and closing, but no sound was coming out. Beatrice had backed away, her hands trembling. "Thank you, Alexander," Claire said. Her voice was different now. The softness was gone, replaced by a cool, regal authority. "I believe it is time." "Time for what?" Richard squeaked, finding his voice. "Claire, what is this? Is this a prank? Did you hire him?" Claire ignored him. She stepped forward, Alexander falling into step just behind her right shoulder, the position of a bodyguard and advisor. "Alexander," Claire said, "could you please clarify for my husband? Sorry, my current husband, the exact nature of the Sterling and Finch ownership structure." Alexander pulled a document from his jacket pocket. "Certainly, madame. The Kensington estate holds 51% of the voting shares of Sterling and Finch. Effectively, you own the company Mr. Caldwell works for." "I see," Claire said. She turned to Richard. "So, Richard, about that promotion you were expecting." "Claire," Richard stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked around at the crowd, seeing their expressions morph from amusement to shock to calculation. They were realizing the power had just shifted. "Claire, baby, let's talk about this in private. This is a lot to process." "In private?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "Like the way you mocked me in private this morning, or the way you mocked me in public 5 minutes ago." She turned to the crowd. She saw the faces of the people who had laughed at Richard's jokes about her. "Richard loves to tell stories." Claire addressed the group, her voice ringing clear. "He told you I was a charity case. He told you he picked me up from the gutter." She took a step closer to Richard. He actually shrank back. "My mother was Silas Kensington's only daughter," she said. "She left this world because she hated the hypocrisy of people like you, Richard. She wanted me to grow up understanding the value of $1, not just the price of it. I lived simply because I chose to. I married you because I thought you were different. I thought you were ambitious, yes, but decent." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "I was researching Richard, but I wasn't researching history. I was researching you." "Me?" Richard whispered. "I wanted to see who you became when you thought no one important was watching," Claire said. "I wanted to see how you treated the minnow, and for 7 years you showed me exactly who you are." "Claire, please." Richard reached out for her hand. "I love you. It was just stress. It's the market. You know how I get." "I do know how you get," Claire said. She looked at his hand, the hand that had pointed at her, dismissed her, waved her away 1,000 times. She didn't take it. Instead, she turned to Alexander. "Miss Kensington, does the firm currently have a morality clause in the senior partner contracts?" "It does, madam," Alexander replied, a hint of a smile on his lips. Section 4, Paragraph 2. Any executive who brings public disrepute to the firm or demonstrates character incompatible with the firm's values can be terminated, immediately, without severance. Richard's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of a table to stay upright. Claire, you can't. We're married. And that, Claire said, is the next thing I'll be correcting. But first, she signaled to the DJ booth. Turn the music back on. I believe I have some networking to do. As the music swelled, Claire turned her back on Richard. But the drama was far from over. Because as Richard stood there, humiliated and trembling, a woman stepped out of the shadows near the service entrance. It wasn't a guest. It was a woman in a trench coat, holding a manila envelope. She looked at Richard, then at Claire. Mrs. Caldwell, the woman called out. Claire stopped and turned. Yes, I'm a private investigator, the woman said, walking into the circle of light. I was hired by the Kensington Trust to vet all associates of the Heir. I found something regarding your husband, something that happened 5 years ago in the Cayman Islands. Richard's eyes went wide. Panic sheer and primal took over his face. No, he mouthed. No, don't. Claire looked at Richard's terrified face, then at the investigator. Speak, Claire commanded. The ballroom was suspended in a silence so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The private investigator, a woman named Sarah Harper, with eyes that looked like they had seen every sin humanity was capable of committing, opened the manila envelope. She didn't hand the papers to Claire. She handed them to Alexander Kensington. Alexander adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. His face, usually an impassive mask of corporate stoicism, hardened into granite. He looked up, his gaze fixing on Richard with a terrifying intensity. Richard, Alexander said, his voice deadly calm. Would you like to explain to the room what Project Blue Heron is? Richard's face, previously pale, now flushed a mottled red. He tugged at his collar. I don't know what you're talking about. It's probably some administrative error. A clerical mix-up. A clerical mix-up, Alexander repeated, his voice dripping with ice. Interesting choice of words. He held up a document for the nearest guests to see. 5 years ago. Sarah Harper stepped in, her voice projecting clearly. Richard Caldwell opened a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Blue Heron Holdings. Over the last 60 months, he has been systematically siphoning funds from Sterling and Finch's high-risk accounts into this holding company. Small amounts at first, rounding errors, then larger sums, skimming off the top of returns before reporting them to clients. The crowd gasped. Embezzlement was the one sin the elite did not forgive. You could be cruel, you could be unfaithful, but you could not steal from your own tribe. That's a lie. Richard screamed, his composure finally shattering. You can't prove that. That account isn't in my name. No, Sarah said, pulling out a second sheet of paper. It isn't. That's the clever part, isn't it, Richard? You didn't put your name on the signature card. You forged a signature. Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She looked at Richard, who was now sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the exit. Whose signature did he forge? Claire asked, though she already felt the sick dread of the answer in her stomach. Sarah looked at Claire with pity. Yours, Mrs. Caldwell. The account is registered to Claire Miller Caldwell. He set it up using your social security number and your old passport information. If this scheme had been discovered by the SEC, the trail wouldn't have led to Richard. It would have led to you. You would be the one facing 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud. The revelation hit Claire like a physical blow. She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. It wasn't just greed. It was a fail-safe. Richard hadn't just used her as a maid and a punching bag for his ego. He had curated her as his scapegoat. He had kept her small, kept her isolated, and kept her ignorant of their finances so that if the walls ever closed in, he could throw her to the wolves and walk away clean. "My wife handles the confusing paperwork," he would have said. "I had no idea." "You monster," Beatrice Delacroix whispered, backing away from Richard as if he were contagious. Even she, with her loose morals, looked horrified. "Claire, listen," Richard stammered, holding his hands up. It was an insurance policy for us. If the market crashed, we needed a nest egg. I put it in your name to protect us. To protect us!" Claire's voice was barely a whisper, but it trembled with a rage she had never known she possessed. "You set me up to go to jail, Richard. You stole millions and you signed my name." She walked toward him. The fear she used to feel when he raised his voice, the anxiety of displeasing him, it all evaporated. In its place was a cold, hard clarity. "I spent 7 years worrying about starched collars and coaster placement," Claire said, her voice rising. "I walked on eggshells to keep you happy, and all that time you were building a cage for me." "I did what I had to do," Richard yelled, cornered. "You don't understand this world, Claire. It's dog eat dog. I needed leverage, and you were just there. You were nothing. You were happy being nothing." "I was never nothing," Claire said. "I was just waiting." She turned to Alexander. "Mr. Kensington, as the majority shareholder of Sterling and Finch, I believe I have a fiduciary duty to report internal theft immediately." "Indeed you do, madame," Alexander said. He pulled a phone from his pocket. "I have the federal authorities on speed dial. They are actually stationed in the lobby waiting for my signal. We've been tracking the Blue Heron account for 3 months. We just needed to confirm the signature was forged." You knew?" Richard looked between Alexander and Claire. "We suspected," Alexander said. "We needed to see if you would confess or implicate your wife. Tonight you proved exactly who you are." Richard looked at the doors. 2 men in dark suits were already entering the ballroom, moving through the crowd with purpose. The FBI. Panic overtook him. Richard Caldwell, the man who prided himself on control, lunged. He didn't lunge for the door. He lunged for Claire. "You witch!" he screamed. His face twisted into a mask of hatred. "You set me up. You knew." He raised a hand to strike her, a reflex born of years of bullying. But the hand never landed. Alexander Kensington, despite his age, moved with the speed of a viper. He caught Richard's wrist in mid-air, twisting it behind his back with a sickening crunch. Richard howled in pain, dropping to his knees. "I wouldn't do that," Alexander whispered into Richard's ear. "Assaulting a federal witness adds 5 years to the sentence." The FBI agents arrived, hauling Richard to his feet. He was panting, his hair disheveled, his tuxedo jacket torn at the shoulder. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to save him. He looked at Thomas O'Leary. Thomas turned his back, examining a painting on the wall. He looked at Beatrice. She was checking her makeup in her compact mirror. He looked at the crowd. They were holding up their phones, recording every second. Finally, he looked at Claire. "Claire." He wept, the fight leaving him. "Claire, please. I'm your husband. Don't let them take me. I can fix this. We can fix this." Claire looked down at him. She saw the man she had loved, the man she had feared, and realized he was neither. He was just a small, greedy man who had mistaken kindness for weakness. "You're right, Richard," she said softly. "You are my husband, and as your wife I'll make sure you have the best legal representation." Richard's eyes lit up with hope. "You will, yes." Claire smiled, and it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll hire a lawyer to ensure the divorce papers are served to you in your cell properly. Goodbye, Richard." The agents dragged him away. His screams of "Claire, Claire" echoed through the gilded hall until the heavy oak doors slammed shut, silencing him. The ballroom was quiet for a heartbeat. Then slowly the string quartet began to play again. Alexander straightened his jacket and turned to Claire. "Are you all right, madame?" Claire took a deep breath. She felt lighter, as if gravity had released its hold on her. "I'm fine, Alexander. Actually, I'm starving. Is there any way we can get a cheeseburger?" Alexander smiled. "I own the hotel, madam. We can get you whatever you wish." The weeks following the Obsidian Gala were a blur of flashbulbs, lawyers, and headlines. The video of Richard's arrest had gone viral, accumulating 50 million views in 48 hours. The title of the most popular upload was "Billionaire Heiress Evicts Husband from Reality." Claire moved out of the sterile penthouse she had shared with Richard. She didn't want it. She instructed Alexander to sell it furniture, clothes, and all, and donate the proceeds to a shelter for victims of domestic financial abuse. She moved into the Kensington estate, a sprawling historic mansion on the North Shore that sat on a cliff overlooking Lake Michigan. It was a fortress of stone and ivy, filled with the history of her ancestors. For the first time in her life, she had a home that couldn't be taken away from her. But the war wasn't over. Richard was in custody, denied bail due to being a flight risk thanks to his hidden offshore accounts, but he was fighting. He had hired a sleazy defense attorney named Saul Vance, no relation to the banned name list known for getting white-collar criminals off on technicalities. Claire sat in the library of the Kensington estate, surrounded by stacks of leather-bound books. Alexander sat across from her, pouring tea. "He's pleading not guilty," Alexander said, placing a document on the desk. "His lawyer is arguing that you were a willing participant in the Blue Heron scheme. He claims you signed the documents yourself and are now framing Richard to keep the Kensington fortune to yourself." Claire laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "He's delusional. The handwriting experts have already confirmed the forgery." "He knows he can't win on the facts," Alexander warned. "He's trying to win in the court of public opinion. He's leaking stories to the tabloids, painting you as the unstable, vindictive wife. He's saying you were mentally ill, that he was your caretaker." Claire's hands tightened around her teacup. "He's still trying to control the narrative, even from a jail cell." "We need to cut off his oxygen," Alexander said. "We have the criminal charges locked down, but the divorce, that is where he thinks he can hurt you. He is demanding spousal support. He claims he became accustomed to a certain lifestyle, a lifestyle he claims he provided, but which he is now arguing he deserves compensation for because your secret wealth caused him emotional distress." "He wants alimony?" Claire asked, incredulous. "From the woman he tried to frame for a felony?" "The law can be peculiar," Alexander admitted. "However, I have taken the liberty of arranging a meeting with his legal team. They want a settlement. They want $10 million to go away quietly and stop the press leaks." Claire stood up and walked to the window. She watched the waves crash against the rocks below. $10 million, she mused. "That's a lot of money, even for me." "It is pocket change to the estate," Alexander reminded her. "But it is the principle." "No, Claire turned around. Her eyes were hard. He doesn't get a settlement. He doesn't get a payoff. If I give him 10 million, he wins. He walks away thinking he outsmarted me one last time. Then what do you propose? I want to meet him, Claire said. Madam, I advise against that. He is dangerous. He's in a supervised visitation room behind bulletproof glass, Claire said. He's not dangerous anymore. He's just pathetic. I need to look him in the eye, Alexander. I need him to know that the checkbook is closed. The Cook County Metropolitan Correctional Center was a stark contrast to the Grand Vanderveer Hotel. The walls were cinder block, painted a depressing shade of institutional green. The air smelled of floor wax and stale sweat. Claire sat on a metal stool. On the other side of the thick glass sat Richard. He looked terrible. His designer haircut had grown out shaggy and unkempt. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that washed out his complexion. The arrogance was still there, but it was brittle now like a cracked mask. He picked up the phone receiver. Claire did the same. "You look expensive," Richard said, his eyes raking over her cashmere coat. "Spending my money." "It was never your money, Richard," Claire said calmly. "It was never even our money. It was stolen money." "I made you," Richard sneered. "Before me, you were a nobody librarian. I gave you a life. I gave you status." "You gave me an ulcer," Claire corrected. "And anxiety. And a deep-seated belief that I wasn't enough. But let's skip the nostalgia. Your lawyer wants $10 million. It's a fair price." Richard leaned in, fogging up the glass. "Think of the headlines, Claire. Secret heiress was a mental patient." How Claire Caldwell begged her husband to commit fraud. "I can make things very ugly for you. The Kensingtons value privacy, don't they? How much is your privacy worth?" Claire looked at him, really studying him. She realized she didn't hate him anymore. Hate required energy. She just felt a profound sense of disappointment that she had wasted 7 years on a man so hollow. "You think you have leverage," Claire said. "But you're missing a piece of the puzzle." "I have plenty of leverage. I know where the bodies are buried." "Richard," Claire sighed. "Do you remember the prenuptial agreement?" Richard laughed. "We didn't sign one. I insisted on it, because I thought you were a gold digger. Best mistake I ever made. That means I'm entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage. And since you inherited the trust during the marriage—" "Actually," Claire interrupted, "inheritance is generally excluded from marital assets in Illinois. But that's not the point. The point is I didn't sign a prenup. But you signed a morality clause with Sterling and Finch. So they fired me. Old news." "Yes," Claire said. "But do you know who holds your personal debt? The mortgage on the penthouse? The loans for your Aston Martin? The credit line you used to gamble in Vegas?" Richard frowned. "The bank holds them." "Not anymore." Claire smiled. "Sterling and Finch bought to the debt packages from the bank last week. It's a common practice for distressed assets." Richard went still. "I own your debt, Richard. All $4 million of it. And since you are currently unemployed, incarcerated, and have no assets because the government seized your accounts," she leaned in closer to the glass, "I am calling in the loans immediately." Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. "If you continue to leak stories to the press," Claire said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I will ensure that not only do you stay in prison for the fraud, but I will bury you in civil lawsuits for the debt. You will never own a credit card again. You will never own a car. When you get out of here in 10 or 15 years, every penny you make bagging groceries will be garnished to pay me back." Richard stared at her, the blood draining from his face. He realized the trap had snapped shut. He had no cards left to play. However, Claire continued, I am generous. If you sign the divorce papers today, uncontested, no alimony, no settlement, and you issue a public retraction of your lies, I might be inclined to forgive the debt. I'll let you start at 0 instead of -4 million. She placed a hand on the glass. It's a one-time offer, Richard. It expires when I walk out that door. Richard looked at the door. He looked at Claire. He looked at the orange jumpsuit reflected in the glass. The master of the universe was gone. All that was left was a desperate man. Where do I sign? He whispered. The wind at 50 stories up didn't just blow. It hummed. It was a low vibrational frequency that resonated against the reinforced glass of the Kensington Tower, a sound that Claire had come to associate with freedom. It had been exactly 6 months since the night of the solstice gala. 6 months since the world had tilted on its axis, sliding Richard Caldwell off the edge and leaving Claire standing firm at the center. Claire stood on the private terrace of the chairman's suite, her hands resting lightly on the cold limestone railing. The Chicago skyline stretched out before her, a sprawling grid of amber lights and steel canyons, beginning to glow as the autumn sun dipped below the horizon. The air was crisp, biting with the promise of winter, but Claire didn't shiver. She didn't feel the cold the way she used to. She adjusted the cuff of her jacket. She wasn't wearing the invisible grey cardigans of her past life, nor the ill-fitting dresses Richard used to criticize. Today she wore a bespoke suit commissioned from a tailor in Milan, sharp, architectural, and white. Not the white of surrender, but the blinding white of a supernova. Her hair, once pulled back in a severe apologetic bun, was now cut into a sleek, chin-length bob that framed her face with precision. She took a sip of her espresso, the bitter warmth grounding her. From this height, the people down on the street were just specks. Minnows Richard would have called them. But Claire didn't see minnows. She saw the city she now helped shape. In the last half-year, she had cleaned house. Sterling and Finch was no longer the predatory shark tank Richard had thrived in. Under her direction, and with Alexander's ruthless efficiency in executing her vision, they had pivoted. They had divested from the volatility of high-frequency trading and moved into sustainable infrastructure and ethical tech. The old guard, the men who had laughed at Richard's jokes about his charity case wife, had been systematically interviewed, evaluated, and in many cases escorted out of the building with their severance packages and non-disclosure agreements. Claire had learned that mercy didn't mean weakness, but she also learned that keeping toxic people in power was a cruelty to everyone else. The heavy glass door behind her slid open with a soft hydraulic hiss. Claire didn't jump. She didn't flinch. She simply turned, her movements fluid and deliberate. Alexander Kensington stood in the doorway. The wind caught his silver hair, but he looked as impeccable as ever, a tablet tucked under his arm. "The board is gathering, Madam Chairman," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the wind. "The quarterly projections are prepped. They are nervous about the renewable energy acquisition in Nevada, but they will vote whichever way you signal." "They're nervous because they lack imagination." "Alexander," Claire said, stepping back inside the climate-controlled quiet of the office. "They look at a desert and see sand. I look at it and see the future of the power grid. We aren't just managing wealth anymore. We're building a legacy. Make sure Thomas O'Leary knows that if he interrupts me today, I'm buying his golf club and turning it into a public park." Alexander allowed himself a rare, dry chuckle. "I believe Mr. O'Leary has learned his lesson after the last meeting. He is terrified of you, Claire." "Good," she replied. "Fear keeps them honest. Respect keeps them loyal. I'll settle for the former until I earn the latter. She walked toward her desk, a slab of black obsidian that seemed to float in the center of the room. She was ready to head to the boardroom to take her seat at the head of the table, but she noticed Alexander hadn't moved to open the main doors yet. He was lingering a rare hesitation in his posture. "What is it?" Claire asked, pausing. "Is there a problem with the SEC filings?" "No, madame. The filings are perfect," Alexander said. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer. "The mail arrived while you were on the terrace. Most of it was screened by the assistants as per protocol. But this was marked as personal. It bypassed the filters because of the return address." He held out a white envelope. It wasn't the thick, creamy cotton paper used by their investors. It was cheap, thin wood pulp paper, the kind you could see through if you held it up to the light. The stamp was crooked, and in the top left corner, stamped in red ink, were the words, "FCI, Terre Haute, Inmate Correspondence." Claire stared at the envelope. Her heart didn't race. Her palms didn't sweat. She felt a curious detachment, like she was looking at an artifact from a museum exhibit about a civilization that had died out long ago. "From him?" she asked, her voice even. "Richard," Alexander confirmed. "Do you want me to shred it? Burn it? I can have it disposed of before you even touch it." Claire looked at the envelope, then at Alexander. "No," she said softly. "Give it to me." She took the letter. The paper felt gritty against her manicured fingers. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, turning the envelope over. Her name was scrawled on the front. Claire Caldwell. He hadn't used her maiden name, nor had he acknowledged that she had legally dropped his surname weeks ago. To him, she was still a possession. She slid her finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of lined yellow legal paper. The handwriting, once so sharp and aggressive, the handwriting of a man who signed checks with a flourish, was now cramped and erratic. It slanted downward, as if the words themselves were depressed. She unfolded it and read, "Claire, I have a lot of time to think in here. The lights never really turn off, and it's loud, but in my head, it's quiet. I keep replaying that night at the Gala. I play it back, frame by frame. I keep thinking about what I said to everyone. How I told the room you were nothing. How I told them I saved you. I realized something last night, staring at the ceiling of my cell. I didn't say those things because they were true. I said them because I was terrified they weren't. I needed you to be the minnow, so I could feel like the shark. I needed you to be small, so I could feel big. But you were never the minnow, were you? You were the ocean, vast and deep and dangerous, and I was just an idiot treading water thinking I controlled the tides because I knew how to swim. I'm sorry. Not for getting caught, though I am sorry about that, too. I'm sorry for not seeing you. I spent 7 years looking in the mirror, and I missed the only real thing in the room. Claire read the words twice. A year ago, a letter like this would have broken her. She would have wept over the what-ifs. She would have searched for the man she thought she married between the lines of ink. She would have wondered if there was enough love left to salvage the wreckage. But today she felt the words hit her like rain against a window pane. They touched the surface, but they couldn't get inside. The apology was valid. It was perhaps the most honest thing Richard had ever written. But it was too late. It was the apology of a man who had lost his audience, a performer realizing the theater was empty only after the curtain had fallen. He wasn't sorry he hurt her. He He was sorry he had underestimated her. There was a difference. She looked up from the paper, her reflection staring back at her in the darkened glass. She saw the woman Richard described the ocean. He was right. She was vast. She was powerful. And oceans didn't mourn the stones thrown into their depths. They simply washed over them and continued to move. "Madame," Alexander asked gently from the doorway, "we are 5 minutes late." Claire didn't look back at the letter. She folded it along the existing creases, precise and final. She didn't tear it up. Tearing it up would imply emotion. It would imply anger. And she had no anger left for Richard Caldwell. She had nothing for him. She walked back to her desk and held the letter out to Alexander. "File this," she commanded. "Under legal?" Alexander asked, taking the envelope. "No," Claire said, smoothing the lapel of her white jacket. "File it in the archives. Create a new folder. Label it Past Mistakes." Alexander's lips quirked upward in a ghost of a smile. He understood. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was just paperwork. "Very good, madame." And Alexander, "Yes. Send a note to the prison warden. Tell him that Mr. Caldwell's commissary account is to be frozen. I believe I mentioned forgiveness for his debt, but I never said I'd subsidize his snacks. Let him learn the value of $1, as he so often told me I should." "With pleasure," Alexander said, tucking the letter away into his jacket. He stepped aside, holding the heavy double doors open. The hallway beyond was lined with portraits of the Kensington ancestors, stern men with mutton chops and pocket watches. But at the end of the hall, the double doors to the boardroom stood waiting. Claire could hear the low murmur of voices from inside. The 20 most powerful men in Chicago were in that room waiting for her, waiting for the charity case, waiting for the librarian. She took a breath. It wasn't a nervous breath. It was fuel. The sound of her heels on the marble floor was a rhythmic, authoritative percussion as she walked down the hall. Click, click, click. As she reached the boardroom, the doors swung open. The conversation inside ceased instantly. 20 heads turned. 20 spines straightened. The rustle of expensive fabric filled the air as one by one the board members stood up. It wasn't a courtesy. It was a reflex. Claire walked to the head of the long mahogany table. She didn't sit immediately. She placed her hands on the leather back of the chairman's chair and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every man there. She let the silence stretch heavy and pregnant with power. She wasn't hiding in the shadows of history anymore. She was making it. "Gentlemen," Claire said, her voice clear, resonant, and undeniably in charge. "Please sit down. We have a world to rebuild, and I'm tired of waiting." Claire's story isn't just about money or revenge. It's about the silent strength that so many people carry hidden beneath the surface. Richard thought value was something you shouted about, something you wore on your wrist or drove on the highway. But Claire proved that true power is knowing exactly who you are, even when the world and the people closest to you try to tell you you're nothing. She rose from the ashes of a toxic marriage, not because she inherited a fortune, but because she finally inherited her own self-worth. Wow, what a journey for Claire, from the invisible wife to the CEO of the Skyline. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you think Richard deserved a second chance, or did he get exactly what was coming to him? I read every comment. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story. Thanks for watching, and remember, never underestimate the quiet ones.